All right, all right. So today we're going to spend most of our time talking about the rendering pipeline for animation. Rendering for animation is very, very different from that of our traditional rendering pipeline. When you're rendering a still, it doesn't really matter. Well, it does matter, but we can afford to spend a couple hours on a single render, right? In the grand scheme of things, we're just trying to draw one picture, but in the animation world, when, in Elliot's case, for example, when we have thousands of frames that we need to render, how long we're committing for a render per frame is something that we need to be very, very, very mindful of. And there's a lot of tricks that we can employ to ensure that we're getting efficient renders that are pretty clean, okay? So a number of you guys have been witnessing and watching me render some stuff over the last couple of weeks, okay? These iMacs in here are not exactly render beasts, okay? They take a little bit long to render our frames, but it's been, I've been engineering an example for you guys that will kind of illustrate a lot of the common problems that you're going to be seeing in your renders starting very, very soon, okay? Because hopefully you put some time and energy into the animation, the composition, the models, and the renders, right? A good animation is ruined by a bad render. Doesn't matter how awesome and how lifelike and how believable your animation is, it's going to get completely destroyed if we present it incorrectly. We have to put as much energy into this phase as we do the other phases. And sometimes it turns into an afterthought, and that's often because of their schedule that we're under, right? You spend 80% of your time just on the animation, and then you go, oh, I got to render real fast, right? But it needs to be as engineered and as thought out as the rest of our production. So I wanted to spend some cycles today really exploring what this looks like from the animation perspective. Because hopefully, if we can, we want to get our renders down to something a little bit more manageable. Something that is maybe 10 minutes, 12 minutes a frame, not 2 hours a frame. Shiny metal things are the most difficult things to render at good resolution. Okay? So let me illustrate, I think, where we're going to begin. A default render coming straight off of Moto without a lot of love. Here, let me open up the actual project file so you guys can start to see. This is that fan that I've been working on for the last couple weeks. Okay. Actually, before we go any further, let me just talk for a second about my media management, because this is something that's going to turn into a little bit of a thing for you guys over the next couple weeks as you start to logarithmically increase the number of files that you're managing. Okay. Have a naming convention and then be disciplined to that naming convention. For me, whenever I name my project files, I always start with the most general kind of project level description of what this thing is. You can see very clearly that all of my Moto project files belong to the exact same project, the vintage fan project. Now, some of these are model files. For me, inside of my own personal naming convention, if it has ANM in there, that means it's an animation. Okay? If it doesn't have AMN in there, it's a model file. I've seen people append and put MOD for mod. I think that's fine. Just have a convention and stick to it. Every single one of us is going to come at media management a little bit differently, but the one common thread between all of our project file names should be consistency. A clear, structured naming system that you continue to disciplining, that's not a word, but you continue to apply with great discipline throughout the entirety of your project file. This should, in every sense, continue into all of your render frames. Trust me when I say this, you want to make sure that you're rendering your frames using this naming convention. For example, here are my renders. So animation 1, ignore these for a second. Here's animation 1. So I know very beautifully that the content of this folder is just that animation 1 project file. Okay? Okay? These I put in here just for today because I didn't want to bring, this is total. I had about 5 gigs worth of rendered frames of all the different passes. So I didn't bring all the frames. These two are just stills from their folders. But I have a folder here of all the color passes. Vol is the naming convention I use for volumetrics. Okay. I have another one. I have another folder called depth. I have another one called fan alpha. Okay, or fan mat. Excuse me. And I place all of their rendered frames inside of those folders. Yeah. In EXR, we're going to talk about that here in a minute, but basically it's a high-resolution file type that saves a tremendous amount of data. It's great for, it's like a TIFF. Yeah, it's a 32-bit EXR, okay? It's about the biggest container for data that we can produce out of Moto, or any image application for that matter. When you get into the high-end cinema world, everything is an EXR, okay? We'll talk more about why I chose to use an EXR for my depth channel here in a minute, but it's a, let's see, if I scroll over, do I have my size in here? Yeah, that one file is 7.5 megabytes in size. I have 264 files per pass, and I have 5 passes, okay? So this turns into like a 2 gig file pretty fast, okay? Anyways, okay, so if we go into like the color, okay, you can see pretty quickly all the frames that are rendered out for this animation, right? And they all honor the exact same naming convention. Now, I rendered a majority of these at different times and on different computers, but I was disciplined in my approach. I used the exact same naming convention, and I made sure that I was rendering my frames correctly so they'd cleanly integrate into the system, okay? Well, oftentimes when we're rendering in a hurry, how we name our files turns into an afterthought, and it's just like render 1, color, map, blah, 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 XYZ, 0012, B, right? And it turns into a cluster pretty quickly.
Did you hand name each one, or is there a batch renaming?
I did. There is a batch renaming. I kind of know what I'm doing, so I kind of set up Moto to render things very specifically. But there is a batch renaming system inside the Apple OS that's okay. I would recommend to invest in a renaming application. I have one called Renamer, and I think it was like $10 or something like that on the Apple Store. It's cool.
Bridge here or not?
Bridge works too. Yeah, Bridge works too. I'm not a Bridge person because I'm not a photographer, but I know that it's in there and it works very well. So in the Apple OS, you have to select multiples, and then I think it's under, where is it? Oh, yeah, rename 5 items. Yeah, and then you can go in and start renaming, doing batch renaming, on the the parameters that you establish. It's not as robust as others, but it's good that we have it rather than not. Why we do this, because all of our image files now turn into source assets for the final composition over in After Effects, and you'll see that here in a second. If we have a good naming convention, we follow that naming convention, we have an iterative workflow. If there's a mistake on one frame, which I have some mistakes and you'll see it, all I need to do is re-render that one frame, make sure it's saved in the same location as its original, and then everything updates in After Effects without having to reload a single thing. It's beautiful. It allows us to update and iterate quickly, okay? We're only able to do that if we're disciplined in our approach, okay? Okay, let's go back to the actual project file and start taking a look at what we're working with here, because there's some unique challenges. Hurry, hurry, hurry. Okay, here it is. So, there's my shot, right? Actually, there's my shot. That's the actual animation coming out of Moto. So this is what we're going to be looking at how to render over the next couple minutes, okay? It's a pretty simple model. I tried to keep this example as easy and as simple as I can to illustrate some of the challenges, the common problems and pitfalls that you guys are going to be stumbling into. If we play the animation, it kind of includes a little bit of everything in here, which is why I engineered it to do this way. I'm using some simple item level animation on the cameras, some dynamics that I'm not controlling for the little papery things off the front. The little blades are spinning. I did that so I have something that could really employ some good motion blur, okay? And this also gives us an opportunity here in a second to talk about lighting in a big way and about motivating light sources and ensure that we're getting continuity between all the frames and all the different shots inside the scene. Believe it or not, motivating light sources is our biggest tool to make sure the lighting setup is consistent between a whole series of different shots, okay? So that's it. That's our target, okay? If you look very carefully, the textures and all of this, I did all of that in Substance Painter, okay? There's not a whole lot of magic, simple materials for the rest of the scene. If we explore the contents of the total scene here, yep, it's a Wizard of Oz moment. You start looking behind the curtain a little bit, and it's pretty simple, okay? That's it. That's my scene, okay? So how do I render a really good-looking shot in a confined space like this, okay? One other thought before I move away from the model. If you don't see it, you don't see it, okay? Now, I have a curtain here that's just a simple plane that I've just twisted a little bit, okay? Bent into form to give me all these little wonderful humps in there. Put a simple material on there, done, okay? I didn't need to go in and model the curtain rod at the top or any other detail because the camera's physically not seeing it. This is one of the benefits of working with our animatic or creating our animatic, is we're going to know, hopefully, what the camera is going to see, and then we build to just what our camera sees. Because I know this is something that took me a while to get out of, okay? Trying to build a recreation of an entire environment where every little single bolt and daub and 100% of this universe is detailed out. Your animatic is going to show you where you need to put all the eggs and in which baskets, okay? Because we don't want to model something that the camera is fundamentally just not going to see, okay? You are literally, and I mean this in the most polite way possible, wasting your time, okay? So you don't want to waste your time on something that the audience or the render camera is never going to see. All right. And, like I said, if you look at this scene from the front, there is no ground, okay? This is all a trick, right? This is not an accurate recreation of the scene. I'm just trying to get something that works to camera, okay? All right, if we go over to the render a little bit, just I'm going to let this cook for a second. This is where we're going, okay? This is where we're going. But this isn't where I began, okay? This is actually a much, much different place than where I began. And I continued to make some corrections post-render, okay, in After Effects. Moto is just one stop along the way. We need to start thinking and viewing our scenes kind of like a traditional painter would. We're trying to extract and generate render layers that we then can composite in like After Effects or Premiere Pro or Final Cut Pro, any image editing application will do, that will help us generate the final look. We're going to come back to what the Moto render looks like here in a second. Let me show you the raw render. This is the first render that I did, and I intentionally didn't really do a whole lot with the lighting. I kept it pretty basic, okay? And I think hopefully you'll start to see the power and the importance of lighting, okay? And how that can have a big effect on the final understanding of your scene, okay? So this is a pretty okay lit scene, but let's break down some of the problems that are inherent and infused in the render frames itself, okay? So if we play the animation, if we look at the still, a lot of you guys are probably saying, sweet, good job, Pat, high five, you're done, right? And it works as a still image. However, when we start to play this animation, a lot of sins kind of get bubbled to the surface pretty quickly. Let's take a look at what it looks like in movement from the render. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys are saying, cool, you're done, Pat. Why? What is going on here? Well, there are some big-time problems in this render. Let me just loop it, and we'll talk about some of these render issues that I'm seeing inside the final shot itself. Okay, so let's talk about the easy things that we can see wrong first, okay? What is the biggest glaring mistake you see in the render? Elwin?
Oh, I see. The silver part of the fan is spinning along with the scene.
The silver part of the fan is spinning. Yes, so we have said that center is moving a little bit slow, okay? You can actually start to see the illusion break down pretty quickly, okay? Because remember, there's no front wall, so what we're seeing on the reflection of the little silver spot in the center of the fan blades is the environment map in the scene, and we're breaking the illusion almost instantly, right? What else?
Render errors.
Lots of render errors. See little white little cubes popping up everywhere? Those are render errors. That's a bucket inside the render, right? Because when you hit the render button, you see those little orange cubes going through the render. That's what a render error looks like. That's when one of the buckets doesn't get the IC data or scene data from the render engine correctly, and that's what you get, okay? Bummer, huh? Bummer. Now, luckily for us, since we're rendering frames, not movies, resolving those render errors is pretty easy. We just go back, we find the frame that has the error, just re-render that one frame, insert it back into the image sequence, or up and running. What else do you see, Mookie?
Sorry about that. I can't see any of the
Yeah, look right in here. The little white squares that pop up. Yeah. Yeah, once you kind of look at them, okay, once you see them, you can't not notice them, right? Yeah, Adrian.
I don't know if you did that on purpose, but two of the cloths went in the line.
Two of the what?
The little wavy things, they're like inside the line. Or,
Inside the little metal cage?
yeah, like, you know how there's like it's like in between or something?
I don't understand.
I don't know how to say it. So, top right,
Top right.
the metal is going in between the hole.
End of top.
The clock piece is.
Cloth pieces are kind of like wrapped around the little metal wire things.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
The one going towards the circle in the middle is
Wrapped around
Putting
it
all
to
up.
point.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You're right. Yeah, you're totally right. Totally right. Not a deal breaker for me personally, but you're absolutely right. Yep, absolutely right. What other render problems do you see?
the lighting on the mirror wire.
Yeah, the lighting is, we'll talk about the lighting here in a minute.
Can I use this spark
Yep,
here?
yep, good, yep. Now we're seeing it, okay? Once you start to kind of blur your eyes a little bit, you can see a lot of the problems that the motor rendering engine is going to produce quite often, okay? Look down here. See a lot of glittery green, right? No bueno, okay? Also, look at the top of the metal cage towards the very, very tippy top of the render. You can see that it looks like it's kind of sizzling a little bit, okay? Those are the reflection rays not doing its job. I saw a hand. I want to make sure that is, yeah.
Yeah, you just said like this, as mentioned.
Yeah, so a lot of reflection issues. In addition, look at the corners here. Once you see it, or once I point it out, you can't not see it, okay? Look at the walls, especially in the corners. They're dancing. They're alive a little bit. There's a little bit of movement inside of all those corners. That's the global illumination engine not working the way it should be working. And we'll talk about why it's doing that here in a second, okay? So this has some big-time problems in there that I need to address. The dancing of all the reflection rays kind of makes it look like it's staticky in certain areas. And the inconsistency of the shadow sizes and the shadow types in the corners along that back wall are also creating a problem for us, okay? Have you ever wondered why your image looks so grainy, or how it always feels like it's kind of soft and moving around, okay? It has everything to do with how we render our scenes, okay? So we need to start fixing some of these problems. Oftentimes, when folks render, they get this result and they go, I can live with that, right? I can't live with it. There's more in here that we can and should look to include in our renders to make it look a little bit better, okay? So this is where we started. Now let's talk and look about how we ended. Because in every single render that we create, no matter how mundane or how seemingly unimportant, we should always be looking to add as much emotion and drama and visual interest in the scene as we can. This, although there are some cool moments in here, it's not as interesting as I would want it to be. It's kind of flatly lit too, right? This is generally kind of the same value. There are no extreme areas of lightness next to extreme areas of darkness. There are shadows, don't get me wrong. If you look down here, there's shadows, okay? And there's very clearly a big light here too. If you look at the light, I've actually lit it poorly, intentionally. Why is the illusion broken pretty quickly for the light?
The light is against the fan, but it's not showing that on the wall.
You got it. The light is actually lit from the wrong side, right? If this was in the room, the screen left side of the fan, so you really can't see it too much, but this side of the fan should be brighter than the other side of the fan, because you have this wonderful window over here that's going to be pouring in light. We should see a really nice change in value going across the fan, okay? So we have some lighting issues in here that we need to also correct. We need to motivate our light sources a little bit. When we have a big window like this, it almost demands that we have light coming from the window, or we should, at the very least, we should be seeing the effects of the light coming from the window on the focal point of our renders. It helps our audience feel like this thing is a little bit more integrated into the scene itself, okay? And there's not a tremendous amount of separation from the background to the foreground when it comes to the fan as well. Areas that we should look to address here in a second. So this is where we started, full of problems and errors that we need to fix. This is where we end up. Something that's a little bit more dramatic, right? And something that really realistically kind of works, okay? Now I've gone in and added a whole bunch of stuff in here to make, let me loop it, to get us through this result. Yeah, go ahead.
Are the dust effects and light and
So the question was, are the dust effects, I'm so happy you saw that. That makes me so happy that someone noticed that. The dust effects are something that I created in Modo, that I rendered out separately and comped in. The lighting effects, we'll talk about the volumetric lightings here in a second. That's a separate pass that I rendered from Modo and I comped in After Effects. There's also depth of field on the shot as well. So the background is now starting to become a little blurred. We're starting to simulate camera effects. How we do that in Modo is pretty cool. Because if there's two things that's going to kill a render instantly, and it doesn't matter what we're rendering, you turn on depth of field and motion blur, it's going to get crazy pretty fast. Okay. While we're talking about motion blur, there's a lot of motion blur on the fan blades itself, okay? We kind of get the correct illusion with the motion blur. Not everything needs to have motion blur on it, but in this particular situation, motion blur is absolutely required, okay? Because if we don't have motion blur, it's going to look like how it looks over here in Modo, okay? Yeah?
Is it a firefly that's on the cord?
Yep. Well, it's actually a correct reflection of the light in the background. And because of the movement in the aliasing, it flickers a little bit. I've actually fixed it. That was what I was doing literally right before you guys came in, and I didn't have a chance to pop out that render from After Effects before you guys walked in. But I want to talk about that, because sometimes people are like, oh, I need to go and re-render it. You don't need to re-render just to fix one little problem. Just clone it out in After Effects, you're on your way. So without motion blur, this is what we're going to get. And the fan effect doesn't feel correct. It feels very jittery. It feels very choppy. So in certain situations, motion blur gives us a tremendous amount of realism and believability. Okay, so this is where we're going. This is it. This is where we're going. So let's start breaking it down and start looking at how we can create and craft this render in an efficient way. Okay, so let's do it. This is going to get fun. Okay, so let's start talking about the global render settings inside of Modo that we need to look at in order to get an animation rendered cleanly. Okay, we're going to talk a lot today about kind of some big picture ideas when it comes to rendering. Okay, we're going to talk a lot about the indirect illumination system, aka global illumination inside of Modo. We want to use global illumination for as much of our shots as we can, but it's often not the best place to begin, and I'll show you why here in a second. In addition, we're also going to be spending some time talking about the global render settings, the reflection rays, the shading rates, some things that we haven't talked about in the past to really get the cleanest renders we can out of Modo. Anti-aliasing, some guys had, yeah, that's an important thing for animation, aliasing. The defaults are never good. Okay, and then we're going to kind of we're going to start talking about render the lighting setup. Okay, I forgot to mention that. Where and how our lights are placed and what type of lights in our scene is going to have a big impact on our render. And then we're going to finish our conversation by talking about render passes and how we can take all of this stuff out of Modo and get it into After Effects to start building a more detailed comp. We don't want to try to ever, as much as we can, try to create every single one of these effects, and I should not have closed it. We don't want to create all the effects for our animation in camera, okay? It's going to be a pretty, here, let's look at the still. So this is the raw render out of Modo, right? We don't want to try to do everything in camera. We want different passes so we can start layering things on top of each other. It actually makes it more efficient. It allows you to troubleshoot your renders, I think, a little bit more directly. And believe it or not, it goes a whole lot faster than trying to do everything in camera, right? Or in one final picture, okay? All right. So let's start talking about the light placement, because that's actually a critical part of every single scene that we have in Modo, okay? Now, if I jump over and let's just go over to the render environment. Let's take a look-see for a second at the lights that I have inside of my scene. There's not too many of them, actually, okay? There we go. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lights, okay? Now, not all of these lights are going to be on, okay? Actually, there's 6 lights because this is the one that's off. This is the volumetric light rays light. We'll come back to that here in a second. But the other lights play a big role in creating my entire scene, okay? So whenever I start lighting a scene, the first thing that I do, and I mean literally the first thing that I do, is I go in and I turn off global illumination. I don't want it on. We shouldn't be relying upon the indirect illumination system, the environment, okay, to be illuminating our scenes. Believe it or not, almost all rendering engines, they want to have direct light sources illuminating as much of the scene as we can. So when I say a direct light source, what in the world am I meaning here? What am I talking about? What's a direct light source?
Like a real light source that comes from like a dedicated object.
You got it. Yeah, an item in the scenes. We're talking about like point lights and spotlights and area lights and directional lights. Those are direct illuminators. Items inside the lighting system that are physically pushing out little light photons into the scene. We want to try to establish as much of our lighting with direct light sources first, okay? And then, once we have that established, we should go in and very strategically enable indirect illumination, the environment, okay? Because that's where all the shadows are going to get, filled in a little bit, and we'll start to create these wonderful bounce effects with the light rays floating around inside of our scene. So two pieces of terminology that are important going forward. Direct versus indirect, okay? There is a time and place for both. Actually, let's not do an arrow. Let's just do versus, okay? Versus indirect, okay? Okay. So let's look at what my scene actually looks like when we start turning off the global illumination or the indirect lighting system. It's pretty neato. So does anyone remember where we can go do that? It's pretty easy. Does anyone remember where? It's in the render item itself, so the purple render sphere, right? Bloop, that guy. If we cruise over to the properties panel, we can turn off our global or indirect illumination in the global illumination tab. There it is, this guy right here. Just turn it off. And this is what my scene starts to look like, okay? Now, if we compare and contrast, it doesn't look that much different than what we saw earlier, and that's the idea, okay? We want it to look generally the same, The indirect illumination kind of gives us a little bit of photorealism, but the general illumination in our scene should be entirely created with the lights in our scene. So, much like we've talked about in other classes, the lighting setups for our scenes are really crucial, okay? We always want to motivate our light sources and create the illusion that our entire scene is being lit by like one light, okay? Or only the lights that you visibly see in the shot, but, do we visibly see any lights in the shot? Not really. We see a window. That's kind of my direct light source. I'm trying to create the illusion that a majority of the scene is being illuminated by that window, okay? However, if you look at my item list, there's what? 5 or 6 direct lights inside of my scene that are helping me create the illusion. Let's start looking at the role of each one of these individually. And honestly, this is how every professional lighting setup and lighting director starts their process, as they try to start with a black scene first, okay? And they add lights, and they start building a composite image based on the lighting of our scene itself. So let's turn off all of our lights. I got one still on somewhere. Or no, that's the environment, excuse me. So to really create a black box, we have to go down into our environment. We got to start turning this on as well, or all this jazz off as well. Okay, oops. There we go. Now we're in a black scene. We've turned off all of our environment options. We've turned off everything in our scene, and we have nothing but black, okay? Because remember, we're trying in every sense to recreate how we place lights in here, good old Mother Earth, okay? And in the traditional Hollywood and lighting world, they often start in a black box. They often start in a dark studio or outside somewhere, and they want to be able to control the light with the illuminators inside their scene. So I always try to start by going through the practice that I've outlined before, establishing a key light. Key light. Now, what's the role of the key light? You got it. It's the biggest, brightest light inside the entire scene, right? It should look like the key light is illuminating everything. If we turn on my key light, you can see pretty quickly that it's doing a pretty good job. It's generally illuminating the majority of the fan, okay? It's on the correct side of the window. Yay, good job for me, okay? Since this is going to be a big light source inside of my scene, if you look down at the actual light itself, where is it in relationship to all the other lights and items inside of my scene? It's right next to my fan. The mistake that a lot of people make is they put their lights pretty far out, away from their subject matters. We want to put our lights right next to our subject so we can control the lighting and really kind of focus the lights on just the things that we're asking them to illuminate. We're not trying to globally light everything. If your lights are really big or they're really far away, it makes sense and it doesn't take too much energy to think that you're going to be illuminating everything in your scene, which is going to make it very difficult to troubleshoot, manage, and create the emotion and drama that we're after. So small lights right next to the objects that they're illuminating, like I've done here. Okay? We're almost trying to create zones of lights inside of our scene. Now, in addition, since this is going to be a big light, the key light, I've also chosen it to be the area light. I really like area lights, especially to give nice, gentle illumination on the subject matter of my shot. Okay? It's a nice, soft light. It's not as harsh as a directional light or a point light, and it gives us just some. Look at the shadows that are being cast on the blades of the fan. That's all thanks to the area light. We need to be very careful, very, very careful with area lights. Okay? Because area lights, believe it or not, actually tie into that global illumination system. Point being, they become very expensive lights to render inside of our scene. If you ever wondered why your render takes 30 minutes to do something really simple, look at the lights that you're using. If you have a dozen different area lights, that's something that we can change to make your render a little bit more efficient. We want to use area lights strategically. Key lights for me, especially if I know the focal points can be right next to the render camera. Key lights are, area lights are good for key lights in a lot of different lighting setups. However, if we continue to explore the rest of the lights inside of our scene, you can discover pretty quickly that I'm only using one area light. Everything else are traditional light types, point lights and spotlights and directional lights. Okay? Check it out. Let's turn off my key light and look at the influence of my fill light. Okay? What's the fill light's main responsibility?
Making the shadows less harsh.
You got it. It's just to kind of fill in the light on the opposite side of the key light. So my key light is shining this way at my fan. My point light, or excuse me, my fill light, which is a point light, is on the opposite side. And it's just giving a little bit of oomph in there in the corners. Okay? Just a little bit of illumination, right? It's not nearly the same brightness level as we had before. If I were to return to my area light and enable its illumination, yeah, you can see that they're working together kind of well to create the final lighting setup. Let me make this top thing. Oops. Here we go. All right. Now, as this starts to refresh, I want you to look at the value change going across, especially the base of the fan. Okay? This has a good contrast ratio. One of the problems that a lot of folks kind of find themselves getting into is all of their renders look flat. They look gray. There's no areas of shadow next to areas of highlight. Okay? This contrast ratio is really important for us to establish because in every sense it starts to recreate reality. Okay? Just looking around the room here, I can see that most people, the computer side of their face is very, very bright. And the opposite side is not as bright. It's not in shadow, it's not in darkness, but it's definitely not the same illumination qualities as we saw on the opposite side. So this contrast ratio is something to manage. Okay? Luckily, since we have small lights right next to the subject matter, we get to control this contrast ratio pretty directly. All right, so let me turn off those. Now I have my rim light, okay? What's the purpose of my rim light? Catch the edges from the background. Yeah, you got it. Okay, that's its big time purpose, and it does a great job of helping to separate some of the background elements from the foreground. Okay, it's kind of catching light all along the back of my fan here, which I'm really digging. Starting to look pretty cool. I'm liking that. And if we have all three of those lights on, yeah, now we're starting to get a pretty good picture as to what this thing looks like. Again, this is with zero global illumination. In my mind, when I'm lighting stuff, I'm trying to get the final look of my scene to like the 10-yard line with directional lights or just direct illuminators first, okay? And then the moment I turn on that indirect illumination, poof, it's just going to get us into that photorealistic world pretty quickly, okay? I think professionally, I see people far too quickly relying upon indirect illumination to create the illusions of their renders, and I think that's a house built on sand, okay, and a render that's going to take forever, okay. Okie dokie, let's keep cruising here. Now, to continue fleshing out the illusion of my scene, I need to start going in and creating some more detail. Now, for me, I put a little bit of a background light, as if maybe there's a desk lamp off screen somewhere that's illuminating a little bit of the scene. It's very orange. Incandescent bulbs are often very orange. Okay, so I wanted to start to simulate that. This projector is really destroying all of my values here. It's much darker on the projector than it is on my iMac. Of course, the window is important, okay? That's just a directional light. Now, I intentionally had the window light in there because I wanted to create this cool little window frame effect, kind of creating some depth in the scene. It's an easy, low-hanging lighting trick that kind of continues to remind us of the 3D nature of our scene, okay? And now I'm not going to turn it on because it will take forever, but then there's my volumetric light. Oh, light rays. This is really intense, okay? I'm okay with it being intense because over in After Effects, because I render it out individually, I can kind of art direct, okay, on the fly. I don't have to keep going back to Modo to render whenever I make a change. That's the beauty of rendering out all this stuff individually, is that we can continue to tweak, make changes, art direct, and make some pretty big wholesale changes to our scene without having to go back to Modo and render. Ideally, we want to render this thing one time, okay? If we need to make a change, let's do that in a place where it's very fast, easy, and cheap. That place is for After Effects, okay? Okay, so I'm pretty pleased. Let me turn off my light rays because that's going to kill my scene. I'm pretty pleased with the way that this is starting to flesh out. Now's a good time to start going in and turning on my environment and start to explore how that environment is going to change the overall look. Once again, this is not using indirect illumination, so we're kind of there for the most part, right? We're pretty close. I'm happy with this. This is generally kind of the direction I wanted to go to, okay? For me, this is the 10-yard line. And when we begin to turn on our indirect illumination, we can really start to see this thing come to life, okay? Indirect illumination is almost always going to brighten our scene a little bit. Now, how it's doing its magic and how it's creating that result is pretty cool. And there's some rules, some ideas that we should look to follow. Since we have our direct illuminators locked down, and I'm pretty happy with the lighting setup, let's spend some cycles really diving deep into what the global illumination system is doing. Okay. Now, this is going to be kind of a nerdy part of the presentation today, but it's an important one. At the very least, you should leave today with just a healthy respect for our lighting technical directors, because they're asked to manage a tremendous amount of information on how the computer is rendering out all these frames. Okay. First and foremost, let's just see where we are here. Things are looking pretty good. Okay. First and foremost, just just so everyone's on the same page of where I am. I've got the render item selected, okay? And I'm over here inside of my global illumination tabs, okay? Okay. So we're going to start at the top, okay? And we're going to work our way down to the bottom. The first one, indirect illumination, okay? Imagine that your environment, okay? Imagine that our entire Moto universe is like the inside of a gigantic beach ball, okay? And on the underside, so the inside of the beach ball, we're plastering an image or we're putting color values on the inside of that beach ball. The number of indirect samples determines how many light rays are generated from the underside of that beach ball. So if we were to draw it on the board here, so this is our beach ball, okay, or if this is here's our little fan. Okay, we're sitting in a beach ball, okay, a big sphere. We place an image on the interior of that sphere, and the number of indirect samples determines how many light rays are emitted from the interior of that sphere going towards the origin of our three-dimensional universe, okay? These are called rays, they're called samples, they're the exact same thing, okay? Someone once described them, think of it kind of like a little archer, a little archery arrow, okay? And on the tip of the arrow, it has like a really fancy sensor on the tip, right? And whenever the environment fires out that ray, it takes some color information with it, but then as it travels through the scene, it's going to hit a couple of different objects in the scene, right? And whenever it hits something, a little bit of that color is imprinted on that object, but it also sends color information back to the rendering engine. The more samples that we have, the more color information is being sent out into the scene, but more data is being received from the rendering engine. It'll take longer to render, but the renders are going to be more accurate and not as grainy, okay? So the number of indirect samples is going to determine how many of those environment rays, or they're actually not called environment rays, they're called indirect rays, are fired out into the scene. Now the default for this is 256, I believe. Now it's going to be really difficult to see in preview, and I'm not going to force you guys to sit through a render, but all of a sudden at 256 it's going to get super, super grainy because there's not nearly as many environment rays going out there, right? The more indirect samples we have, the more accurate our shadow and our global illumination data is going to be, but it comes at a cost, right? It's going to take a little bit longer to render. Now why this is important for animation is because of something called IRradiance caching. The guys and gals that develop our rendering engine, and most high-end rendering engines, are using something called IRradiance caching, okay? Since they know that having a lot of indirect samples is expensive, IRradiance caching was generated to make it kind of a little bit inexpensive to render global illumination. IRradiance caching is kind of like blending, okay? So imagine we have a grid, okay, like the background wall of my little fan scene here, right? Imagine it's kind of like a grid, okay? I apologize for those that are watching the live stream. You're not going to see my awesome illustration, okay? So the environment fires off a ray, it goes and it goes boink, and it hits right there on the wall, okay? Now, if this was the only ray hitting this area, it's going to be pretty grainy and pretty dark in this scene because there's not enough information being sent back to the rendering engine to figure out how to draw that part of our scene, right? So here's what, and you're not going to get one. Maybe you get one here, another one over there, okay? You're going to get a couple in this little area. What IRradiance caching does is says, okay, I'm going to take all of these little ray samples and I'm going to look at their information and then I'm going to blend them together. It allows us to have, just a couple indirect samples and a couple IRradiance cache samples because everything is going to start to get blended together. It kind of approximates. It says, okay, if this square here, if this thing is black and this thing is blue, I'm going to look out a certain range from that sample and I'm going to start blending all those colors together to make something that looks generally okay, right? If you go back and look at my bad render that I did earlier, I used IRradiance caching almost exclusively for that bad render. This is almost all irradiance caching. I really didn't dial up the indirect samples, for my final render at all, okay? And it went pretty fast, actually. However, almost all of the problems that we see in the background here, see, it's just kind of looks like it's jittering, right? It looks like the corners are alive, and I don't know how much you guys can see that from the projector, but on my screen, it is very, and I mean very noticeable. It almost looks like the shadow areas of my scene are kind of dancing. Yeah, I can see it here. Yeah, I can see it here, and I can see it on this wall. I mean, look at this wall here. I think it's probably most noticeable here. That's not compression, okay? That's the irradiance caching in between each frames, changing their blend, okay? Because on one frame, you're never going to see the blend, right? But when it's doing it every single frame, it's spitting out a whole bunch of rays, and how it's blending all of that data is changing in between each frame. So in order to get really super clean renders from Moto that doesn't have a lot of that kind of flickering and because it always feels like everything's vibrating, I'm sure you've seen this in your renders, right? We need to really stop relying on irradiance caching, okay? We need to kind of adopt a hybrid approach. Some folks, some old school renderers, they're going to call it's a great name. It's called Monte Carlo rendering, right? Monte Carlo, that's when we don't use any irradiance caching, when it's just all indirect samples. So we can go in and turn irradiance caching off. And we can just do some. I saw at SIGGRAPH a couple years ago, I saw a really great shirt. I won't say all of it because it's a little bit inappropriate, but it was just so, it said computer, and it shouted computer nerd from the ceiling, right? And there was a shirt that said, brute force Monte Carlo bees, and I was like, are you kidding me? Because a lot of folks say Monte Carlo rendering is just indirect samples, right? So in order to get super clean results, they'll put that number at like 10,000. So they'll fire off 10,000 indirect samples into the scene, and it'll be butter smooth, because the more samples you have, the cleaner your renders are going to be, the more accurate your renders are going to be, right? That gets extraordinarily laborious as far as render times. It spikes it pretty quickly. Can you imagine having 10,000 indirect rays going out? Some rendering engines are built for Monte Carlo, okay? Some rendering engines, they just want to do indirect samples, and that is, their entire engine is built around that idea, and there's some that do it very, very well at pretty efficient speeds. Moto's not built for exclusive Monte Carlo rendering. You can do it. I mean, you can. I mean, it will work, right? And it will work very well. It's just going to take a little bit longer to render. Moto really shines, from my own personal experience, with a hybrid approach, okay? A lot of indirect samples, but then maybe a little bit of irradiance caching, a little bit of blending to kind of fill in a little bit of the grain. And that's what I employed for mine. I did a tremendous amount of Monte Carlo, right? A whole bunch of indirect samples. I think it was at 2K, 2048 indirect samples. And then down here when I had my irradiance caching going, I also had a whole bunch of indirect rays for the final one. Yeah, a whole bunch of indirect samples. I didn't necessarily need this to put this to 2048. I did this I had one shot at rendering this thing, right? And I knew I had some time, so I was like, I'm going to increase my irradiance caching rays just to ensure it's perfect, right? But that came at a very steep cost for me. And on my laptop, I had this down, I think, to right about 512. Oh, we'll get back to why it's this high here in a second again on the irradiance caching. You need it this high, but there's a reason. You're not actually getting all of those irradiance samples. Okay. One other thing that's really kind of crucial, but something you should test, is this environment importance sampling. This is going to get rid of a lot of the fireflies inside of your scene pretty quickly, okay? This is going to start blending all of those environment rays as they're coming out of that big, the big beach ball, okay? So a lot of indirect samples are good. 256 to 1024 environment samples are good. And then for the irradiance caching down there at the bottom, this is something that you have to kind of play with. Okay. Now, one of the things that's kind of fun about global illumination in indirect rendering is this idea that we're sending rays out into our scene, okay? Arrows. They really kind of are like little arrows, okay? Now, if this is the tabletop of my scene, for example, I can, maybe the ray goes, boo, boof, hits the tabletop, right? That first collision with a piece of geometry in our scene is called a bounce, okay? Well, I can tell the computer to keep having that one ray bounce around inside the scene, okay? Now, in a flat plane like this, the angle of reflection is always going to be equal to the angle of incidence, so it's just going to, bounce out something like that, right? Or something like that. On a more complex shape, okay, if it gets stuck here in the corner, maybe it bounces that way. So these rays, if we increase the number of bounces, are going to continue traveling around their scene, sending illumination data into the scene, then also render data back to the render engine, okay? Point being, the number of bounces in your scene helps determine the accuracy of the indirect rendering solution, okay? The default's 1. You can see I put mine to 2, okay? So every ray is going to get a chance to collide with 2 pieces of geometry or 2 items inside of my scene before it's terminated inside the render engine. This comes at a very direct cost. It takes longer because now that ray is spending more time in the scene and is bouncing around more things. However, the render is going to be more accurate, okay? And it gives us an opportunity to change how we're using IRradiance caching. And this is a great trick. Because now we can say, I'm still going to use, I changed it to 256, I'm still going to use a whole bunch of indirect samples. And I believe earlier I had this to 2048. I'm still going to fire off, 2,000 rays into the scene. However, and each ray is going to bounce twice, okay? So a lot of data is going to be sent back to the rendering engine on both those bounces. I've seen some scenes that have 6 or 7 bounces, right? They take forever, but they are butter smooth, okay? I'm only doing 2, and I'm going down here into my IRradiance caching, and I'm saying only do blending on the second bounce, okay? Second bounce only, okay? This is a good little trick, because then the first bounce is going to give us a lot of general shadow, grain, illumination data, and the second bounce will do a little bit of IRradiance caching, okay? A little bit of blending. This hybrid approach works very, very well for the motor rendering engine, and you can get some really clean results from the engine, kind of using this, which is pretty neat. Okay. Now, my IRradiance samples, you're probably saying, Pat, this is pretty high for a blend, right? And you're right, it is pretty high. But this is something that was brought to my attention a while ago, and it's one of those things where you kind of go, there's a reason it works like this, and it drives me crazy that something as important is hidden from most users. If you're doing a 2-bounce system, you're not actually getting all of your IRradiance rays, and I can show this to you. Okay, your IRradiance cache rays are being culled. If we go into the channels section, I got my render item selected, and if I look at its channels, yeah, check it out. Secondary rays, you're only getting 25% of your secondary rays, okay? So, on that second bounce, the rendering engine is only capturing 25% of them, okay? So, at a value of 2048, how many IRradiance cache rays am I actually getting? Half of 2048 is 1K. Half of that is 512. That's a good number to start with, okay? Or 2048, because you're only getting 512 IRradiance cache kind of blending rays. And that's how I think of it in my mind. They're blending rays. Everything kind of morphs together and starts to give us a smooth result. So this hybrid approach gives us some really great results, okay? Here's a cool little trick. This range, okay? This is neat, because one of the things that we often have a hard time with, especially with indirect or global illumination, is getting rid of all that grain. When the rendering engine doesn't have enough information, it just creates grain, okay? It doesn't know what color it should render in that specific area in our scene. So it just often turns into noise. Okay, a lot of your renders have a tremendous amount of noise in them. Okay, one of the ways that we can reduce this noise is by increasing this range. Now, what this range value does is it says, you know, when a ray goes a certain distance, a certain range inside of the scene, if it doesn't intersect anything, if it doesn't hit anything, return environment color data. Okay? Instead of just returning no information, which will produce grain, return to the rendering engine environment color data. Okay? Because we want to have every single ray return color information back to the rendering engine. If a ray by chance isn't hitting anything, it's just going to create grain. Okay? It's going to create all those little black specks that are jittering around our scene. So this is a good trick. Increase the range, and you're going to see an immediate effect for this. Okay? Now this is directly linked to whatever environment you're using for your global illumination. Okay? Now I have two environments in my scene, and I'll show you why I have two. Okay? This first environment is just it's our good old-fashioned HDR probe. This is a Moto preset. Okay? This is what you see very blurrily outside the window. Okay? And if you look carefully, it's visible to camera. It's not visible to the global illumination system, the indirect ray system. But it is visible to reflection and refraction rays. Okay? So this environment is really what's going to be responsible for creating a lot of the reflections that you see in the scene, which is just fine for me. Because I want to create in a lot of my metal reflections what you see out the window. Okay? That's what I'm after. However, what about that global illumination system? Since we're using that range value in my GI settings, it needs to have something in here to return color information, okay? And this is Pat's trick of the day, okay? I don't want to have a material drive that or send back color information into the global illumination system. I want an image, okay? Now if I turn off the image that I have, you can see what happens to my scene quite beautifully, okay? Or it destroys my scene. Because if you look very carefully, the environment material in this environment is just that default shade of gray, right? Just gray, okay? Let's just make it something really obvious. Let's make it a constant color, and let's make it pink. Okay? Now everything is this horrible, horrible shade of pink, okay? What's happening is if we return to our render settings, once an indirect ray goes that value, if it doesn't hit anything, okay, fires off, doesn't intersect with anything inside the scene, it's going to return that pink color to the rendering engine, okay? And it's going to start to, kind of cast a color on a lot of different objects or every object inside the scene. Cool? Okay, that's good. For exteriors, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, indigo, this is quite good, okay? Because now we can put, an environment like I have down here, put an environment material in there that kind of matches, a sky to ground color, and we can very, very quickly kind of create a cleaner render, okay? Now for me, since I'm doing an interior, here's my trick, okay? And this is a good trick. It's a great trick, actually. Because I don't want it to return color information from a material, because that's not serving my purposes very well. What I would really like to have is it to return color information from a complete scene, as if maybe there's a floor or other different objects inside the room that you don't see off camera, which would all produce, color casts and illumination on the subject matter of my scene. So here's what I did, and this is a great little trick. I can't take credit for it, actually. This has been floating around our community for quite some time. But I created an alternative file. Hold on a sec. I hate the way our computer services guys and gals have done this. So I created an alternative file. And it appears as though I did not bring it with me. Okay, so it's an alternative file, and here's what I did. I can actually set it up really fast, okay? If you go back over into Moto, And let me kind of get this back to what I had before. Let's see. Now, it's not going to work as well as it did, but I'll kind of show you how I set it up. We're going to create another camera. And inside this other camera, let's give it a name. I'm going to call this HDRI, or spherical. Okay. And I want to make sure I set my render camera, or my render settings, to this new camera. Now, the default location for every camera is where? The origin of the scene. So right now, my camera is bloop, kind of right down there at the base of my object. Okay, now I'm going to select it real fast, move it up, and I'm going to put it kind of right in the middle of my scene. Okay, at the focal point of where my camera is. Now, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn off all the items that are responsible for my fan. I'm just left with pink at the moment because, because I'm using that wonderful, I can't turn, oh, well, I'll turn it back on. Okay, that's so lovely and not awesome. There we go. Okay. Okay. So what I'm going to do with this new camera is that I'm going to change its projection type from a perspective camera into a spherical camera, spherical map, not spherical VR, a spherical map. And I'm going to go and render me an HDR reflection map. Okay? Yeah. Now this is not actually my scene. If you look at the contents of this scene in particular, it doesn't have a floor. It's not an enclosed shape. In the alternate scene file that I used to create my environment map, I made a floor, I made a couple other objects in there, I made a complete scene, and then I put this camera in the middle, made its render type into a spherical. Now it's going to render the entire scene for me in a map, in a reflection map. Okay? This is what it looks like. After the render is complete, this is what you get. Oops, went into the wrong folder. There we go. Okay, that's the actual reflection map that I created. When it comes to your render settings, you just need it to be twice as wide as it is high. That's just kind of the way it works. Whatever resolution. Some people want to have like this width dimension be like 4K, and I don't know what that value is high. So it's twice as wide as it is high. That's the idea behind it. And now I have, and on this one, I let this sit all night long. I turned on my volumetric effects. I kept the result pretty low on the volumetric effects. I cranked up, I had, I think, like 6 or 7 bounces for my GI engine. Since it's an enclosed room now, I wanted all of my illumination rays to be bouncing around the interior of my kind of little room here before they turned off. If I did 1 bounce, it'd be really dark. The more bounces, everything gets a little bit brighter and more accurate in its color reproduction. I think I even turned off the table in this particular one, which is good. And then this now turned into the HDR reflection map that I put inside of that second environment down here. Okay? That guy. Because this environment is only influencing my indirect rays. So when it comes time for the computer to grab a color, to shade one of the rays when it hits that range, I want it to take the color of my actual scene. Okay? This is a way we can trick the rendering engine, giving us more detail than it's actually there, right? Instead of just picking pink, now it's picking maybe the brown from the floor in the appropriate areas. It's a great way of producing the illusion that we're after. Yeah. It works very, very well. Because let me show you an example here. Let me just turn this off. Okay. I'll turn this to indirect rays. That's the default environment settings, okay? Where it's using that probe, the exterior probe, the direct light in the scene, and it doesn't look realistic at all. actually, right? Because we're using the outside colors to tint the inside, which doesn't make any sense at all, right? My walls are actually green. Okay, if you look at the materials on the walls, it's green. How is it showing up? Blue. I didn't want it to be blue. In all honesty, the inspiration from this room came from my great aunt's house because she had a green wall. This is like the fan and the table in my great aunt's house, right? Before she passed away, my great aunt had a house over here on 46th Street. And every time I went over there, it was like going back into the 40s because not a whole lot changed in that environment for her since the 40s and the 50s. And it had a green wall, had those big kind of stucco patches all over the wall. I mean, it was a time warp, and that was kind of my genesis moment for the scene, right? So how do I get my walls to match the environment color? Well, not use the exterior environment to illuminate the inside of the scene, right? That's where this thing comes from. That looks a whole lot more realistic. Now we're getting there. Now my walls are actually a shade that they're supposed to be, or closer to the shade that they're supposed to be. Okay, that's a cool little trick. Okay, rendering out a spherical reflection map that we can use for our global illumination system is really easy. Okay, just gotta make a new camera, change its render type to spherical versus perspective. We're on our way. Hopefully you guys are starting to see that our renders are really engineered and they're built. Okay, I know at times they often feel kind of randomly created by the computer, but once you start, kind of peeling back the veil of our rendering engine a little bit, you can see that really the settings are pretty easy to kind of manage. Indirect versus irradiance. Indirect's the number of samples being spit out by the environment. The irradiance cache rays are the number of rays that are responsible for blending everything together. Okay. The other thing that we have to manage, and we'll take a break because I know I've been going for a little bit. The other thing that we have to manage are our global settings. So we've been talking a lot about our global illumination section here. Okay. But let's go into our settings because there's some things in here that are really important. First and foremost, let's start down here under our samples. Okay, reflection samples. You saw earlier in my bad render that it looked like the table was just all glowing at the bottom. The metal bands around the tippy top of my fan, it looked like it was just alive and it had this static. That's because there was too few reflection rays inside of our scene. The default, believe it or not, is 64, okay? And at 64, the default, it better be if they're just off, okay? Because 64 rays is never going to give you a good result, like ever going to give you a good result, okay? You're almost always going to have to drive this value up high, very high, okay? You can see that I landed on 2048. That wasn't by chance, okay? I very strategically rendered certain sections that I thought were going to produce a lot of problems, and I said, okay, what's that one section look at 512? Not enough. What's that? Okay, let's re-render that one section at 1028. Is that going to give me the result I'm after? Nope. Let's do 2000 rays. Let's see if that's going to give me. Yep, that's it right there. So I'm not just cranking all these values. I'm kind of methodically stepping them up and doing a test render on just a small portion, right? I don't want to do a test render for the entire frame because that'd take an hour, okay? But I can do a very small portion in my render region to give me the information I need to make a good decision. Same thing goes for all the other ones. My indirect samples and my irradiance. I actually stepped those up to make sure that I wasn't spending time or wasn't wasting render time on something that was going to go unseen. Now, one other thing. This is actually something that we need to look at as well, the direct light samples. This is the only place that we really see the direct light samples. If you're using direct light sources often, as I am, this is going to help increase the number of photons that are coming out of that direct light. Okay? That's really, 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 really going to help. I think a lot of folks, and I remember I was definitely in this category as well, I was always afraid to increase the quality. Increase the number of rays being fired out by the engine, because I remember when I first started, I was like, 512 should be enough. That's a lot of rays. But in the bigger picture of things, 512 is like low quality. Okay? Especially, and this is something that's kind of important for us, especially at the resolutions that we're rendering this at. I'm rendering this at 1080p, so that's a pretty high resolution image, okay? If I was rendering this at cinema quality, 4K, right? UHD, as they say. Worst name ever, right? Ultra high definition. Anyways, okay. If we were rendering at cinema 4K, okay, all of these values would need to be increased by, what, 4, I think. Because this information does scale. So if I double the resolution, I quadruple the number of rays that are being spit out into my scene, which is a scary thought to think about. You know, I have 10,000 rays during. Well, this is why Industrial Light and Magic and Pixar have like the computing power second to that of the United States government. Because in order to make The Last Jedi, all your stuff's going to be super high quality. Okay. But do you see a lick of grain in any of the renders? Nope. Right? Nope. I've seen pictures of the ILM render farm. It is amazing. It is amazing. Needless to say, they're not rendering on little iMacs like we are. Okay? They're rendering on, server grade workstations, with the each. I've seen pictures. It's like a never-ending. It's like that shot in Indiana Jones when they put the Ark of the Covenant away in the warehouse. It's like that. It's a never-ending chasm of server cabinets, right? And there's just thousands upon thousands of processors inside of that environment, all whose sole focus, whose exclusive focus is just to render. Okay. Anyways. One final thing, and this is something that's kind of important for us in the animation world, okay? Anti-aliasing. The default anti-aliasing value is 8, okay? Now, 8 is really great for a still image, but when our stuff starts to move, it's going to feel like everything's just kind of staticky a little bit. 9 times out of 10, that's an aliasing problem, okay? If we increase the aliasing amount, 32 is a good place to begin, okay? Believe it or not, this is still kind of a low-res setting, but for my scene, this is as far as I needed to go. I've seen some renders that are in like the 128, 256 world for anti-aliasing. This is going to start to blend some of our frames together. And when there's a lot of thin objects, indigo, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, when there's a lot of really thin things, okay, small pieces of geometry inside of the frame, we need to increase the anti-aliasing to stop them from jittering, okay? Yeah, it's going to feel, it's also going to increase the quality of your motion blur as well, okay? We can actually preview our motion blur inside of the preview window. This is an easy thing. Let's do it. Motion blur, okay? Yeah, now you can see the motion blur starting to take shape in preview, which is pretty cool. If I was to drive my aliasing back down to its default sample of 8, yeah, you can almost see it. It's so grainy and so dotty. It'll be very, very noticeable in the final render too. So if there's a lot of movement, and especially if there's motion blur and a lot of thin, kind of small chunks of geometry, increase your aliasing. That's going to help get you a nice clean render. Comes at a cost. It's going to take long to render, but it's going to look pretty good. In addition, if you're utilizing a lot of bump maps and there's a small, like 1 or 2 pixel little highlights going across your whatever, like your floor, you're going to increase your aliasing. So a lot of that stuff starts to get blended out in between the frames. Okay. All right. I tell you what, I've been going for about an hour. So now's a really, really great time to take a break, and we'll come back and talk about render passes. Sound good? All right, let's do it. Okay, so I want to just kind of wrap up today talking about multipass rendering and actually the render process, because there's some things in here that we need to look at before we hit that magical F9 button and start to render our frames, especially for animation itself. Okay, so let's go back to my my render layout and cruise through a couple specific things. Okay, first and foremost, okay, do yourself a tremendous amount of sanity saving, okay, by changing before you render a single frame, or preferably before you animate a single thing, and open up a good old render or your sequence settings, okay, and change your scene start to frame number 1. Okay, I don't care what your scene end is, right? Because everyone's shots are going to be different lengths, but we don't render frame 0, right? We render frame 1. There is no frame 0. There's always frame 1. Okay, even inside of our frame rate counters, right? It goes from frame 23 not to frame 0 and then to frame 1 to start the next second. It goes from frame 23 to frame 1. Okay, so the rest of our entire nonlinear editing and compositing pipeline is built around the idea that frames or sequences start on frame 1 and they go through, whatever their conclusion is. Okay, that's going to help you keep your sanity. Okay, especially when we start taking things over in After Effects that wants to have their sequences start on frame 1, not frame 0. There's no frame 0. Okay, so scene start always on frame 1. That's a good idea. All right, now the next thing that we need to look at once we have that kind of established are all of our render passes. Now these render passes, these render outputs, really determine what the computer is going to create for us. These are physical image sequences, and this isn't all of them that I'm going to be making for this object. Okay, of course there's the final color. Awesome. That's kind of what you see is what you get inside the preview. Naturally, we're going to be rendering that out. But there are a few others that we should also look to render out to start to add more detail and more layers inside of our scene. The next one is called the depth output. Now you can add a render output easily just by duplicating any of the two, the defaults. Alpha and final color are the defaults. Or you can add one by going into render outputs. Okay, so add layer, render outputs, and then depth. I always forget where it is. Here it is. It's under basic. Okay. What the depth does is produce a black and white image that's going to map the distance a pixel is from the render camera to a grayscale value. Now, how we use this is to create a really quick approximation of depth of field. Let me show you what it looks like. So here's my depth output. If I start my preview window, okay, there's final color. Okay, it's just going to sit here and progressively update for a second. However, if we go into this effect button inside of our preview window, we can preview any of the render outputs that we've loaded into our shader tree. And let's take a look at depth. And this is what it looks like. Okay, the pixels, the polygons that are closest to a render camera are going to be brighter. The pixels that are further away, or the polygons that are further away from our render camera are going to be dark. Now we need to figure out this depth, because this actually isn't what you're going to see when you create your depth pass the first time. This is what you're going to see. Okay, it's just going to make everything white, and a lot of people go, WTF? This is stupid. This is unusable. And you're right, it is unusable. So what we need to do in order to make this a useful pass to help us create the depth of field, okay, to create blurry backgrounds and create something that's more photographic, is that we need to enable this remap pixel values. Now the critical part in here is determining the depth of our scene. You can play around with this if you'd like. I'll just turn it on. And you can see that we have this maximum depth value pop in. You can increase and decrease this slider. You can see what it does. Okay? Or if you really wanted to get super accurate, here's what I do, and a lot of folks do this. We actually measure our scene. Now I'm going to look at my scene from the top. And I want to know how far the middle of my camera is to like that back wall. I want to know what that distance is, because that's really kind of the depth that I'm capturing inside of my scene. So I'm going to go into my View pull-down menu, and we have this wonderful ruler tool, and yet, probably guessed it, I'm literally going to measure the length of my scene. Okay. It puts it down here. Here it is. There's the ruler. So let's see. This one, oh, my snapping's on. This one's going to go over here. And you just have to get generally kind of close. This isn't, yeah, there it is. So 47 feet, okay, 2 inches. That's the depth of the scene itself, okay? Now, I'd put that value into that channel box that you saw on my depth render output and then fire off a render, okay? Now, when you're rendering this out, let me just turn it off. Yep, I had it at 44 feet earlier, but 47, that's close enough for government work, okay? Oops. Let me turn off my ruler tool. There we go. This renders very, very quickly. Now, this is 1080p. You see how fast that renders? Because the only thing it's rendering is grayscale pixels, okay? So it's not looking at indirect illumination. This is a quick render. And how we can use this over in After Effects is to use it as an influence of a blur, okay? Because I only want to blur the background. I don't want to blur the objects that are closest to the camera, the focal point of the camera. I just want to blur the stuff that's in the background, okay? Now, in order to get the best, and I mean the best result out of our depth, we don't want to save or render out a PNG, okay? We want to render out a 32-bit EXR, that guy. These 32-bit EXRs create gigantic containers for data, okay? And basically, well, here's the big picture idea. When it comes to images, you're not seeing all the data that's stored in a pixel, right? There's a tremendous amount that's gone unseen. It may look black to you, but it could be this ever so slightest shade of dark gray. But you see black. But the computer doesn't, right? The computer is going to be able to interpret and see a much wider spectrum of values than our visible eye is ever going to. This OpenEXR Float 32-bit is the biggest container for this data. It's really great to use with something like a depth channel because sometimes there's nuance. Okay, we want to be able to finely adjust the blur in After Effects, and this gives us the best result. However, it also produces very, very large files, okay? So test it out. In one scene, you might not need an OpenEXR file for the depth that you're trying to create. If it's a relatively simple shot, a PNG will serve you just the same. Yeah?
What's the difference between the two? The float and the float?
Float and tiled, yeah. The tiling one are really for, you can create a map in Modo, a tiled map, and it basically takes all of your images and it does a mediocre job of kind of taking every image map that you have in a material group or in your images folder as a whole, and it tiles them. It places them on a big grid, okay? I'm not sure why you'd want to do that, but that's what it does. I really don't know what the application for that is, and my understanding is, that's what it's designed to do. Okay, so that's what the depth pass is all about, and it's a really cool way for us to do depth of field. We're going to look at this here in a second. Okay. In addition, we also want to start, and this is something that I do exclusively. Okay. I always render out alpha channels. Okay. Now, if you've taken an image editing class, you're probably used to the idea of alpha channels. What does an alpha channel do? Or a matte? Huh? Transparency. It's a transparency channel. Now in Modo, we're only ever going to create transparency information for geometry. If you look at the alpha channel for my scene, what isn't white? The window, right? Okay, and the stuff outside the window. There's actually a piece of pane window glass there that's almost invisible. Okay, which is why it's the light gray. Okay, but that background photograph is part of the environment. It's not geometry, so it's not going to calculate transparency information. I always do I always do a lot of different alpha channels. One, a global, right? A global alpha channel for just the raw geometry in the scene. And then I go back in and I make alpha channels for the focal points or for the different objects inside of my scene itself. This is where it starts to get a little bit laborious, but it's the most important thing we can do. And you can start to see how I do this. I have a project file here that's sole purpose is just to produce an alpha channel for my fan. Okay? If you look at what I got going on, it's not anything really fancy. I just basically have taken every single part of the fan, and I put it in its own material group, okay, and I give it its own shader. So this is the moving parts, okay. This is the blades of the fan and the little papery things in the front. They get assigned their own material group. I give them a shader because the shader does two things. It drives the quality of the associated polygons and the visibility, which is what I'm after, right? So here's the fan itself. And then the base shader, I basically said anything that's assigned to the base shader is invisible to camera. Okay? It's still being evaluated and rendered, but it's invisible to the render camera. Okay? And what this gives me is an alpha channel for just the fan. Okay? I can use this in a lot of different layers, and you're going to see this in action here in a minute. Okay? You always want to make sure you have an alpha channel for your focal point, just in case. It really does come in handy. Look how long it takes to render. Alpha channels are kind of like depth passes. They're next to nothing. I think I rendered the alpha for the fan on my laptop during my lunch break. It took me about 30 or 40 minutes to render it all out. It goes pretty fast, okay? I'm not going to sit here and do it because it's like watching paint dry. Okay. So we're striving to create a couple different things: depth, transparency for different critical parts. Like Indigo, I can just see her stuff on the scene. Now she has that lovely mouse jumping through. If I was rendering that scene, I would absolutely want to have an alpha channel for just the mouse in case I need to make that brighter or darker or do some color correction on just that one element. I don't have to re-render the entire sequence. I can just do that level correction over in After Effects thanks to the alpha channel.
If I have all the moving objects in a separate file, would I just do that separately with the alpha channel?
You could? Yeah.
I was thinking of rendering like this is just one solid frame.
Yeah.
And having the mouse
animated on top.
separating.
So Indigo brings up a very, very cool way of accomplishing her goal, right? This camera doesn't move, right?
No.
Yeah, the render camera doesn't, yeah, so it's a lockdown shot. Now in mine, I intentionally had my camera moving, right? I didn't want it to be locked down. I wanted a moving shot so I can have, because it illustrates the importance of having moving alpha channels, right? But if your camera's locked down, render your background once, right? Just render a single frame, and then put your moving elements either in their own project file or put them in their own material group like I've done here, assign them their own custom shader, and put everything that's not associated with that. So the background, not visible to camera on that base shader. And you're still going to get all the correct colors, the correct reflections are going to be there. It's going to be as if the background was just black and you're just going to see the mouse. And that will greatly increase your render times. Most of the problems that you're going to have on yours, Indigo, are going to be the background. So if we can render those frames once.
Yeah, is there a way to have the shadows kind of included in that?
Yeah, the shaders. Yeah, the shaders are how you do it. Because all that stuff is still being calculated. You know, if you look at here are the two custom material groups that I created. This is just for the static fan parts, and this is for the moving parts. You know, this base shader is the default shader, right? Since all the polygons that are associated with these two groups are separated from the base shader, I get to turn it all on and off. See, there's my scene, visible to camera, and it's all off. We're still, we're still casting shadows, receiving shadows. We're still influencing the reflections in the indirect stuff as well.
I noticed when you import things, it automatically gives them their own.
Yep, that often happens. Yeah, make sure if you want, drag it above the base shader so that custom shader or that new shader in your imported section is actually doing something. Yeah, because whatever's on top is going to influence whatever's below it, right? Okay, so depth channels are awesome because it allows us to very quickly create camera or a depth of field We don't want to do that inside of Modo because it just kills our render. And I mean, it takes it from being an hour to 3 hours like that, okay? It takes a tremendous amount of CPU power to render depth of field. The results are going to be stunning, but it comes at a price, right? The depth channels are quick, easy things that we can render without too much energy that gets us close enough, right? Yeah, we just need to be close to depth of field. Now, so these are all prep things that I do before I render. I haven't rendered anything yet. The last thing that I need to do before I start rendering stuff is start establishing a good media management system over in my Finder. Okay. Now I have a folder called Color, a folder called Volume. This is for, I go out and I render all my volumetric effects separately. This is what it looks like. It's not magical at all. It's just everything turned off. You know, all the materials turned off except for the directional light, and what you get is blackness on everything, and just the volumetrics come through, which is cool. But I put everything in a folder, right? Because we're going to be creating image sequences. Okay. This is fan alpha. Okay. So that one goes in there. Oops, I missed. There we go. Okay. We want folders. Don't render all of your image sequences into one folder. Okay. That's how you want to smash your computer, because that just turns into a beast that you can't manage. Put it into small separate folders, little containers. It seems obvious, but surprisingly, very few people do this in this class, and it's going to save your bacon on December 13th when you're trying to submit your final project, to have everything nice and cleanly organized into a whole series of folders. Because as a reminder, when you're rendering image sequences, this is what you're going to get, okay? So in order to get really clean results, okay, let's talk about how we can use these folders. I create my folders first, and then when I'm over here in Modo, check it out. And let me just cruise back over to my master. There we go. Okay, so check it out. I have my final color render output selected. Okay? What I do, because I want my final color output to go in its own folder, I want my alpha channels to go in their own folder, the depth channels to go in their own folder. I'm trying to pipe all of these individual image sequences into their own unique folder system. So the output file name section there is your friend in this moment, right? Because now we can go in and tell the computer, just send this image sequence to this location, okay? Now, I can't do it because it's not, I created all those folders on my hard, oh wait, no, yeah. Here, I'll just pipe it into my thumb drive, which has the exact same structure. So I'll just color, okay, and give it a good name, okay. Now you can see my naming convention here, the name of the project file, the animation, this is the shot number basically. I always put render so that I'm very clear as to what this thing is. This is a rendered frame, right? So this is like a high value, most important piece of my media management system, okay? This is not a test render. This is not a throwaway. This is something that's going to show up in the final film, okay? This is a render frame. This is the second time I've rendered it, okay? How many of you guys have done that? You've rendered multiple versions of the exact same thing? I do it often. It happens. You do re-renders, right? But just don't do, this drives me crazy when I see people do this, right? They'll see final 1, final 2, final 3, and it's like, no, guys, this is a render. This is the second time you've rendered this. What type of pass is this? This is the color. This is the color pass, okay? And then, of course, this is the frame number. There's one small change that we need to make in Modo to get a very clean frame number in here. And this is also going to help you kind of manage all of these frames as you start to render, okay? Here, I'll tell you what. Let me do this. I'm going to render, I'm going to cancel. And I'm going to render my depth. And I'm just going to put this on my desktop. I'm going to change it to a PNG, and I'll just do vintage fan nm1 rdo2. Okay, and I'm not going to put, this is depth. Okay, so this is the kind of user-defined file name for the image that's going to be created. Now watch what happens if I leave the Moto defaults as they are. Watch what Moto adds after this. Okay, so let's save, and I did that for Final Color because I'm a dork. There we go. Okay, and I'm going to render, animation. I'm just going to do first frame 1, last frame 1. And it's going to say, hey, do you want to use the file names specified in the render outputs? Yes, I do. Okay. It's going to render it real fast. When I go over to my desktop, as soon as it's done, there it is. Okay. But look what Moto did to the naming convention of my file name. Okay. Now the first, 20 characters or so, that's me. Vintage fan, animation 1, render 02, depth, and then what did it do? Underscore, depth, output, and then the frame number. No likey, right? Because I've already told the computer what I want my file name to be. I just need a frame number, okay? Now there's a great function inside of the Moto rendering engine that allows me to control what the computer is going to append my file name with. Okay? And it happens on the render item itself. It's this output pattern. Okay? This is what the computer is going to append your file name with. Okay? Render pass group, which we haven't talked about. The output. Okay? This is the name of the render output. Okay? Left and right. I don't even know why that's in there anymore. This is for stereoscopic rendering, like 3D TVs. No one does this anymore, right? So I don't know why it's in here, but I know why it's in here. And then lastly, you get the frame. Excuse me. I just broke Moto. Then we have the frame number over there. So what I want is just the frame number. So I always go in and delete it like that. And I think you can even save this output pattern on my home Mac. I have it just so it's just frame number. Because now when I watch what happens when I render the animation now. There it is. Ha! That's what I'm after, right? Because I added depth in there, and all I want Moto to produce is a frame number for me. It makes me the driver, and kind of it makes me in the driver's seat on how I manage all of my files. Okay? Because when you're dealing with thousands of these things, it's actually very important. Okay? So make sure you look to change the output pattern before you render. You only really get one shot at it. Okay? So you don't want to have to go back in and have to re-render or batch rename things. You can control it if you choose to control it, and I would absolutely recommend that you control it. Okay, real fast, I wanted to show you how to use that depth output and maybe why we choose to go in and render out all these alpha channels individually, because there's a purpose for it. There's a role for this entire thing. Now I'm just going to do it with stills. I didn't bring my entire render with me, so let me do this. Let me go. Well, actually, I take that back. I may have it all. So here's my color. All right, of course we know that we need to interpret our footage and make sure we're using the right frame rate of 24. There we go. All right. And now I'm going to go in and just grab my fan mat. And I'm also going to just grab the single still of my depth map. There we go. All right. Make a new comp for my render. There it is. Looking pretty good. Pretty pleased. Looks awesome. Now, it's important that when we're doing any sort of image editing or correcting, that we always evaluate our renders at 100% magnification. Don't evaluate at 50. Don't evaluate at 200. You're going to get a false read every single time. 100% is the best way to see if things are working the way they should work. Okay? If you got a good render, oops, got a good render, nice and clean. Yeah, very pleased with it. If you look, there's not a whole lot of dancing up here at the top as we saw before. Hit the space bar, do a simple RAM preview. There's a little bit, but it's close enough for government work, as they say. You're never going to get rid of 100% of the grain, okay? Never, ever, ever. But we can mitigate a majority of it if we're careful. Cool, I'm happy with that. That's looking pretty good. Now let's start adding in some stuff. Let's do that depth map. Pretty cool, because this is pretty neat. This is a great, great trick. Now for the depth map, you just need to have it somewhere inside of your After Effects comp. Somewhere. Doesn't matter where. It doesn't even need to be visible, okay? It just needs to be in there at some point. Because what we're going to do is that we're going to apply this depth map as the driver of a blur for this color channel. And I'm going to hit the return key and just rename this color depth, okay? So I'm going to select my layer that's got my color information on it. And under the Effect pull-down menu, it's under Blur and Sharpen, Camera Lens Blur. The whole purpose of this blur is to simulate depth of field, okay? If you look at the image, everything looks kind of blurry at the moment, okay? Not really super hot, okay? You're probably wondering, Pat, this is not awesome, okay? However, once we start going in and adjusting some of the properties of our blur, we can make it awesome, because one of the things that we need to do, check it out, there's a category here that says Blur Map, and it's looking for a layer in this current composition. Now I'm going to choose my depth layer, and now, aha, look, my background's in focus. You can see that my background's in focus, but my fan is not. It's looking at that grayscale image, and it's saying if it's a black pixel, it's in focus. If it's a white pixel, it's not in focus. So we need to adjust the blur focal distance. And I'm just going to left click and drag interactively slider here. I'm going to zoom out because this is kind of fun. Watch the fan. You can actually see it come into focus. Yeah, see how it's like wonk right there? Absolutely. No, seriously, you can. It's got a stopwatch next to it, so you can absolutely do a rack focus if you'd like. Yeah, and that's pretty close. I may be within a value or two, but because it doesn't necessarily give you the correct read. Yeah, if I put it back down to 0, invert it, in some situations it's not going to work. You're kind of doing the same thing. So this one, it's okay. Yeah, in this particular situation it works, but I've had it not work in other moments. So, all right, that's pretty cool, because now if you look at it, the fan's in focus and the background is not. All thanks to that depth map. We've just kind of cheated depth of field in After Effects, where it's very cheap and easy to render to create these effects. That's kind of cool. And if you want it to be more blurry, this is a cheat. This is absolutely a fake. This is not true depth of field, but for a lot of shots, this is all you need, okay? So be careful with this. A lot of folks are like, I'm going to go 77%, and that's what you get, okay? We can actually repeat the edge pixels to clean it up a little bit. But that's just gone poo-poo all of a sudden. That's garbage, okay? I usually keep it at, like, for me, there has to be a very specific reason for me to go above like 8 or 9 on my blur radius, because after that everything starts getting soft and it doesn't really matter what you have. It's just everything kind of goes soft. Yeah, right, maybe. But this is a great way to kind of get that soft depth of field look, and now you can see that that background is starting to get blurred out like it would be in a camera. Okay, it's a quick, easy way of getting depth. Now another thing that we can do is our volumetrics. Okay, now this is something that I just did because I'm crazy. That's what it looks like. Okay, if I change my blend mode to screen, I'll make all the black pixels transparent. Now we're getting there. Okay, and now I can art direct this if I wanted. I can shift the hue, I can increase the brightness, decrease the transparency. I don't have to go back to Moto to re-render this every single frame, which is going to get expensive and lengthy. Now I can kind of iterate pretty quickly here in After Effects. Okay, in all honesty, when I was looking at this, I went, you know what? This is when I started seeing all of my layers come together. I said very directly, my fan is not as bright anymore as I want it to be. I want just the fan to be a little bit brighter. Well, because I have that fan mat, I can bring that in, okay, and use this to drive an effect, okay? Now I'm going to make an adjustment layer. I love me some adjustment layers, right? Let me turn off my mat for a second. Adjustment layers are containers. They're invisible containers that we can place effects into in After Effects, right? If you're used to working in Photoshop, it's the exact same idea, right? You can put an effect on it. Anything below it in the layer stack is going to be influenced by the adjustment layer. I'm going to do some levels on here. And see how I'm globally making everything bright? Let me crush the blacks just a little bit, but I just want that effect to happen on the fan. Well, the cool thing about working with adjustment layers is that they can take mattes and masks for us. I want to use the black and white transparency information on this alpha channel. Okay, you can see it here. That's why it's all white. To influence and act and serve as a mask for this. We do that in After Effects through called track mats. Think of it like a cookie cutter. The mat is the cookie cutter. The adjustment layer is the cookie. So the mat is always going to be on top of the cookie. Okay? If I have the cookie selected and go over here to my track mat column, I want to load in the alpha. It only looks up one layer. It's always going to look up to the layer above it in this pull down menu. There it is. So now this adjustment layer is only influencing the things below it, but it's also using the mask to determine what's going to get adjusted. And this is a great way to isolate. Oops, is it in fact doing it? No, it appears as though it's still affecting everything. There we go. I had it on the wrong one. It's luminosity, not alpha. I apologize. Now it's just doing it on my fan. Yeah, it's kind of amazing too, because if you start to look at it, uncorrected, it looks kind of flat. Yeah, uncorrected, it kind of looks kind of flat, but the moment I do a little bit of levels on it, I start to push it a little bit into the black, I went really too far. Yeah, but it's starting to just separate just a little bit more. Yeah, with it on and off, it just kind of pops a little bit. Makes it a little bit brighter. Didn't have to re-render, make those adjustments here in After Effects pretty quickly. Cool, huh? And then I started doing other layers. I got about 8 other layers in mind that's influencing the final effect. And this is just kind of my style and my aesthetic. I went in and, because I'm a super nerd and that's just the way I do it. It's how I roll. I went in and made little dust flakes in Moto with my particle system, rendered out an alpha channel of all my dust flakes, brought it in, matted it out, affected it, blurred it, and lowered the transparency. I only have them showing up inside the light rays because I'm a super nerd like that. That's actually where you'd see them only, right? And then I did a vignette and a whole bunch of other effects and color corrections on the background and the foreground. Eventually, after all of that work, you get something that looks pretty good, okay? But in every sense, it speaks quite wonderfully to the importance of multi-pass rendering, right? Because we can very, very quickly get to that end result without having to spend hours and hours and hours and hours doing a whole series of needless renders.
Can you replay it?
Yeah.
I saw something.
Oh yeah. So there is a firefly. Something snuck through, but that's not a deal breaker for me. That really isn't. And I mentioned this earlier. I cloned it out while I was eating my lunch today, because that's one problem that I can fix pretty quickly. Okay, That's just a simple clone. I can't tell you how many times that's happened, you know, where it's like, I'm not going to re-render this entire sequence just to fix one pixel. I can do that in 10 minutes in After Effects with the cloning tools. And I just didn't have a chance to render it out before you guys walked in the door today. Yep. Pretty neato, huh?
So for a moving shot like this, did you had a different alpha for each, you had a different alpha for each one, and then
Yeah.
is there a way to like procedurally have it go through every frame and know which alpha to use?
There is a render passes system. It takes some effort to get it to set up correctly, but that's the way to procedurally do it.
Well, I mean, yeah, because you've got all your alpha frames, you've got all your final color frames. So did you do that
Well,
each individual one?
in Modo, what it does, if there is a render output on and visible, it's going to render all those render outputs simultaneously.
Oh, so it's a, wait.
Yeah, it renders all of them at the exact same time. So
It's a separate file, isn't it?
it does, yeah. No, yeah, and that's the cool thing. If you have everything piped correctly, okay? So I have my depth information being sent to this location on my hard drive, okay? I have my alpha stuff being sent to its own location on the hard drive with its own naming convention. When I hit render animation, it gets me this. It says, do you want me to use the file names associated in the render outputs, which is going to honor the folder and the file naming convention that I established on the outputs.
Right. I mean, in After Effects, did you go in and do each frame individually, or was there a way to have it?
What do you mean?
So say you did that for the first one, right? You've got you did the parent with composition, and then it uses that one alpha. But for the next frame, does it just knows to use the next alpha in line?
Yeah, because it's image sequences, right? Yeah. Now I didn't bring today on. I didn't transfer over. The image sequences for my depth, my image sequence for my fan mat, my image sequence for my global alpha. I have my dust too. They're all image sequences, right?
You just tell it to use this image sequence?
You got it. Yep. Yeah, it's very similar to how we work in Photoshop, but instead of working on a single image, we're working on image sequences because everything's moving, right? Questions, comments? If there's one thing that I hope you guys take away from today, is just the idea that we need to engineer our renders. They're not afterthoughts, right? You need to pay as much attention, maybe even more attention, to how the computer is drawing your image than what's being drawn, okay? Because at the end of the day, this is the stage where you physically get to make the thing that your audience is going to be, looking at and interfacing with, and that's important. If you really like this part, if you nerd out on stuff like this is called job security, okay? Because yeah, not a lot of folks like this stage. You have to be a special type of person. You have to be really, really, really patient. They're called render wranglers, lighting technicians. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. Okay, questions, comments, concerns? Okay, let's take a second and look real fast at our calendar once again, because I think we need to have a little bit of clarity as to when you should be rendering. Okay, now I wanted to talk about this conversation today because by the next time I see you guys on December 1st, think about that. The next time I see you, we're starting a new month. With the Thanksgiving break rolled in there, it changes pretty quickly, okay? Or the pace changes pretty quickly. So the next time I see you guys, you should be close to being finished with your animation, okay? If you're not done, you should be close to being done. Because we need to start rendering. In my opinion, you should have your renders going by the 5th, okay? So bring what you have with you on the 1st, okay? You should be rendering by the 5th, okay? Because you want to have, let me give you some experience. It's going to take longer than you think, okay? It always takes longer than you think. So if you understand that, if you pad the schedule a little bit, if you give it a warm hug every day that this is going to take a long time to render, we can plan for it, we can schedule, we can budget for it. and it won't become this immovable force in our life. It's something that we can really kind of sidestep quickly, okay? Also, plan around the idea that you're going to have to re-render this, okay? There may be portions like you saw earlier. The first render that I created had a whole bunch of render errors in it. That wasn't my fault. That was the computer messing up. Sometimes the computer is just going to screw you, okay? And there's nothing you can do about it other than re-render, okay? Hopefully, the reality of our situation is starting to sink in. We need to move very, 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 very quickly. If you haven't had a chance to finish up your animatic, you need to do so immediately, okay, to get this thing done, okay? Because honestly, we don't have a lot of time. Thanksgiving completely throws a monkey wrench into the entire operation here, because our production is going to come to a screeching halt, you know, Monday or Tuesday of next week. Yeah. Questions, comments, concerns? Are we in panic mode? I'm in panic mode already for you, and I'm not even having to make this stuff. I'm like, my palms are all sweaty just thinking about what you guys are going to have to do in front of you. You're going to get a tremendous amount of time, and I mean a tremendous amount of time on the first to work on your final project in class, okay? However, don't use this as kind of like a crutch, like, oh, I got all this time on Friday to work on it. No, you gotta work a lot on this on your own too. Okay? Yeah, Mookie.
So just to make sure, the depth and the alpha is like rendered by itself?
Yeah, render it by yourself in separate passes. Yep, separate image sequences. They're quick, easy things to render. They don't take a lot of effort. The thing that costs the most is that final color render output. Yep. And remember, direct light sources are key. Don't turn on indirect illumination. Actually, and this is, in all honesty, this is what I do for every single project. The first thing I do when I start rendering is I turn off global illumination, okay? Because I want to be able to create the illusion with direct light sources first, okay? And then GI is just going to kind of fill in the gaps a little bit. They make the shadows look pretty badass, and you know, kind of make the entire lighting setup feel like it's kind of integrated. But global illumination comes at a price. It takes a while for those frames to render. Sound good? All right, good luck. May the force be with you. I'll see you guys next month. And have a happy Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.